One missed call at 12:02 a.m., a cold termination email at 5:59 a.m., and by 10:17 a.m. The woman they thought they'd eliminated from the game held all the power they'd tried to steal. This isn't a story about revenge. This is how someone erased from their own invention used that very invention to slam shut a door they never saw coming. Isla Carter had never been fired before. At 34, she'd built her entire identity around being indispensable, the kind of engineer who solved problems others couldn't even articulate. As lead researcher at Novaris Dynamics, she'd spent the last 3 years breathing life into what would become their most revolutionary renewable energy technology. The email arrived at 5:59 a.m. while I was still unconscious on my office couch. Not asleep, really, more like collapsed. 12 straight days of testing had finally caught up with me, and my body had simply quit negotiating. The timestamp would later feel like a calculated cruelty, arriving just before the world woke up, ensuring I discover my professional death in complete isolation. Subject: termination of employment, effective immediately. My phone had buzzed earlier, 12:02 a.m., according to the log, an unknown number. I'd been too exhausted to reach for it, my hand heavy as lead on the worn fabric. 4 days without real sleep will do that to you. 4 days splitting time between the lab and the hospital, watching my father's monitors while running calculations in my head, trying to solve 2 different kinds of life or death problems simultaneously. The email was brief, clinical. 3 sentences that dismantled everything I'd built. Your employment with Novaris Dynamics is terminated effective immediately due to failure to respond to critical communications. Your access has been revoked. Personal items will be shipped to your address on file. I stared at the screen, waiting for my brain to process what my eyes were seeing. My laptop was still warm against my legs, still logged into the testing protocols I'd been monitoring. But when I tried to access the main server, nothing. My credentials, gone. 7 years of work vanished between heartbeats. The coffee maker in the corner gurgled to life on its timer, 6 a.m. sharp, like always. The normalcy of it felt obscene. How many mornings had I watched that machine brew while reviewing overnight test results? How many breakthroughs had come with that first bitter sip? My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. Instead, there was this strange stillness, like the air before a storm. I pulled up my personal laptop, muscle memory typing passwords for backup systems I'd wisely maintained on private servers. That's when I found it, the termination order, time-stamped 9:47 p.m. the night before the call. They'd decided to fire me 3 hours before that critical communication I'd failed to answer, which meant the call wasn't a lifeline. It was a setup, a box to check. We tried to reach her. She didn't respond. 'Cause established? The realization should have made me angry. Instead, it made me sharp, clear. For the first time in 12 days, the fog of exhaustion lifted completely. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone who needed me gone before morning. Before the week's board meeting. Before the final investor presentations, I knew exactly who. Dominic Hayes had been with Novaris for exactly 93 days. I knew because I'd counted each one, watching him circle my project like a vulture identifying carrion. Vice President of Strategic Development, a title invented specifically for him, carved out of budgets and responsibilities that used to belong to people who actually built things. My fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision, navigating through server logs, email chains, digital breadcrumbs I'd never thought to look for before. The picture assembled itself in fragments. A meeting scheduled for 7 a.m. that morning, one I hadn't been invited to. The attendee list read like a corporate coup: Hayes, the entire board, and representatives from Kuroda International, the Japanese conglomerate preparing to invest $1.3 billion in our renewable energy division. My division, my project, my Helios core. The trail went deeper. 2 weeks ago, Hayes had requested comprehensive documentation on Helios core's architecture. Standard procedure, he'd said. Due diligence for the investors. I'd complied, spending 18 hours compiling reports, schematics, test results. Everything except the final layer, the one I'd never documented, never discussed, never even hinted at in any official communication. Another email thread, this one from Hayes to the board, dated 3 days ago. Succession planning for critical roles needs acceleration. Single points of failure in our innovation pipeline present unacceptable risk to investor confidence. Single point of failure. That's what I'd become. Not a lead engineer, not the person who'd solved the thermal degradation problem that had stumped the industry for a decade. Just a risk to be mitigated. I pulled up the security footage from my lab, one of the few systems my personal credentials still accessed, a quirk of the university partnership that had birthed Helios Core in the first place. There was Hayes at 11:47 p.m. last night, using his override code to enter my workspace. He stayed for 13 minutes, long enough to review the physical prototypes, to photograph the whiteboards I'd filled with calculations. But he couldn't access the core system. Nobody could, not without me. The phone call at 12:02 a.m. made sense now. They'd discovered the lockout, panicked, tried to reach me. When I didn't answer, when I was unconscious on this couch, burned out from keeping my father alive and my life's work on track, they had their excuse. Unreliable, unresponsive, unfit for the responsibility. I opened a new terminal window, accessing the Helios Core's diagnostic interface through a backdoor I'd built during the early development phase. The system status glowed green, humming along perfectly. The final test results from last night showed efficiency rates that exceeded our most optimistic projections by 12%. We weren't just competitive, we were revolutionary. And in 3 hours, Hayes would stand in front of a boardroom and claim it all. My reflection caught in the black screen of my phone, hollow eyes, unwashed hair, the ghost of someone who'd given everything to build something extraordinary. But ghosts have their own kind of power, don't they? They can walk through walls that others think are solid. I typed a simple command into the diagnostic terminal. Not malicious. Nothing that would damage the system or compromise the technology. Just a gentle adjustment to the authentication protocol, tied to the employment database. A living system recognizing its creator. The timestamp read 6:23 a.m. when I finished. In that moment, I wondered if Hayes had slept well, confident in his victory, if he'd practiced his presentation, memorized the talking points I'd written in those comprehensive reports, if he'd already started spending his bonus in his mind. The strangest part was how calm I felt. No rage, no tears, just a crystalline understanding of what had always been true. I hadn't built Helios Core for Novaris. I'd built it because the world needed it, because the problem demanded to be solved, because I was the only one who could see the solution hiding in the chaos of failed attempts. They could take my keycard, my email, my title. They could rewrite history, erase my name from papers, pretend I was just another replaceable component in their corporate machine. But they couldn't take what lived in the space between the code and the hardware. In the quantum signatures I'd woven into every process. They couldn't steal what they'd never understood existed. Hayes was about to learn why you don't fire the architect while you're still living in the house they designed. The memories came in waves, each one sharpening my resolve. 3 years ago, Helios Core had been nothing more than an equation scrawled on a napkin in the university cafeteria. Born from a conversation with my father about why solar panels degraded so quickly in extreme conditions. He'd been lucid that day, his engineer's mind still catching sparks of brilliance between the fog of early-onset dementia. "The problem isn't the heat, Ela," he'd said, tapping the napkin with his pen. "It's the memory. Materials forget what they're supposed to do." That single insight had consumed me. While others at Novaris chased incremental improvements, I dove deep into molecular memory, thermal coefficients, the poetry of particles under stress. The old lab in Building C became my second home, a forgotten corner of the campus where the university's partnership with Novaris allowed for the kind of unstructured research that corporate timelines usually strangled. I remembered the first breakthrough at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. The prototype had maintained 92% efficiency after 600 hours of accelerated testing. My victory whoop had echoed through empty hallways, and I'd actually cried, exhaustion and joy mixing into something that felt like vindication. The security guard had found me asleep on the lab floor 2 hours later, surrounded by printouts of data that would eventually revolutionize the industry. But success has a way of attracting attention. Within 6 months, my solo project had a team. Within a year, it had a budget. And with the budget came the vultures in suits, talking about market positioning and intellectual property strategies. The erosion started small. My name, which had been first on the initial patent filing, somehow slipped to third in the revised documentation. Alphabetical order, they'd explained. The weekly meetings I'd been leading shifted to collaborative sessions run by project managers who couldn't explain the basic physics of what we were building. My lab access went from 24/7 to standard hours for safety compliance. I'd adapted, evolved, learned to navigate their politics while protecting what mattered. Every time they pushed me to the margins, I dug deeper into the technical architecture. While they fought over credit and positioning, I solved the problems they didn't even know existed. The thermal cascade failure that had killed the project twice, fixed during a weekend they'd forgotten to revoke my lab access. The quantum efficiency barrier everyone said was theoretical, broken while they were at a conference in Miami, congratulating themselves on progress I'd made. Layer 7 had been my insurance policy, though I'd never named it that in my mind. As the core architecture grew more complex, I'd built in a final authentication layer, not out of paranoia, but from an engineer's instinct for redundancy. The system needed to know its creator, needed a biological signature that couldn't be faked or transferred. It was elegant in its simplicity. My retinal pattern, my cardiac rhythm, my neural firing patterns when I thought about the specific equation that had started it all. I'd implemented it during the last phase of development, when everyone was focused on the upcoming demonstrations. A few extra lines of code buried deep in the initialization protocols. Not hidden, exactly, just undocumented. After all, they'd been so busy removing my name from presentations, they'd stopped asking about the actual work. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd spent months trying to minimize my role, to present Helios Core as a collective achievement where no single person was indispensable. And in doing so, they'd given me the freedom to make myself absolutely essential. My phone buzzed, a text from Maria, the only colleague who'd ever acknowledged what I'd built. Something's wrong with the system. Hayes is losing his mind. What did you do? I didn't respond. There was nothing to say, nothing to explain. I'd done exactly what I'd always done, solved problems, built solutions, created something extraordinary from nothing. The only difference was that this time, I'd remembered to sign my work. Outside my apartment window, dawn was breaking over the city. Somewhere across town, Hayes was probably adjusting his tie, reviewing his slides one last time. The board members were arriving at the office, coffee in hand, ready to witness the future of energy technology. They just didn't realize that future had a memory, and it remembered who had given it life. The realization hit me at 7:43 a.m. as I watched the diagnostic panel from my laptop. The termination trigger had executed exactly as designed, not through any malicious intent on my part, but through the elegant logic of a system protecting itself. 18 months ago, when corporate security had insisted on integrating employment verification into all critical systems, I'd been the one to implement it for Helios Core. The irony was delicious. Their own paranoia about insider threats had given me the tool. The moment my employment status changed from active to terminated at 5:59 a.m., Layer 7 had activated its protective protocols. The system hadn't locked down. That would have been too obvious, too aggressive. Instead, it had simply forgotten. Like a person with selective amnesia, Helios Core still functioned perfectly, still processed data, still showed green lights across the board. But when it came to executing new commands, initializing presentations, or transferring control, it politely declined to remember how. I pulled up the remote monitoring interface I'd built into my personal research app, disguised as a meditation timer, of all things. The core temperature readings were optimal, Power flow steady, all subsystems nominal. To anyone checking the basic diagnostics, everything would appear perfect. The trap was invisible until you tried to actually use the system for anything beyond its current state. My phone showed 17 missed calls now. I recognized the number patterns, the IT department, security, Hayes himself. The cascade was beginning, right about now. They'd be discovering that their master override codes were useless. That their backup authentication methods led to the same polite refusal. Biometric signature not recognized. Please contact system administrator. I was the system administrator, had been since day one, though they'd tried to transfer that role 6 different times to 6 different people. Each time, I'd complied on paper while ensuring the system knew the truth. You can change titles, reporting structures, org charts, but you can't change the fundamental recognition between a creator and their creation. The truly beautiful part was the legal framework. When I'd insisted on building Layer 7, I'd documented it extensively in the technical specifications, pages 847 through 863 of the full system documentation, buried in subsection 7.14.3, in language so dense with technical jargon that the legal team's eyes had glazed over when they'd reviewed it. They'd signed off on it, approved it, made it part of the official intellectual property of Novaris Dynamics. But they'd never understood what they were approving. A biometric lockout that couldn't be overridden without destroying the core quantum matrices. A dead man's switch in reverse, instead of activating on my absence, it had activated on my corporate death. At 8:15 a.m., I made myself coffee with the same mechanical precision I'd once applied to particle alignment algorithms. The morning news played in the background, talking about energy futures and breakthrough technologies. If only they knew that the biggest breakthrough of the decade was currently having an existential crisis in a boardroom across town. The authentication wasn't just about access, it was about continuity. Every process in Helios Core carried my biometric signature like a watermark. Try to force past it, and the quantum states would decohere. The delicate balance of forces that made our impossible efficiency possible would collapse into expensive, useless hardware. It was like trying to forge a signature on the molecular level. Theoretically possible. Practically catastrophic. I'd given them everything they'd asked for. Documentation, processes, training materials. I'd been generous with my knowledge, transparent with my methods. The only thing I'd kept was the right to exist within my own creation. And they'd tried to take even that. My secure partition showed me the panicked activity on the company servers. Emergency meetings being scheduled. Crisis management teams being assembled. Legal documents being reviewed. They were moving through the stages of corporate grief at remarkable speed. Denial, anger, bargaining would come next. The beautiful thing about elegant engineering is that it doesn't require force. No dramatics, no grand gestures, no malicious code or destructive commands. Just a simple truth embedded in silicon and light. This system knew who had built it, and it would wait, patient as stone, for that person to return. By 8:30 a.m., I'd finished my coffee and opened my personal project files. If Novaris didn't want me, perhaps it was time to revisit those other problems I'd been too busy to solve. After all, Layer 7 wasn't just a security protocol, it was a blueprint for what came next. At 10:17 a.m., Maria's text came through with a video attachment. You need to see this. They're in full meltdown. I opened it against my better judgment. Someone had recorded the presentation room through the glass wall. Shaky footage, but clear enough to see the disaster unfolding. The massive display that should have been showing Helios Core's revolutionary efficiency curves instead showed a single line of text in austere system font. Authorization incomplete. Biometric signature missing. Hayes stood at the presentation podium. His usual swagger evaporated, even through the poor video quality. I could see the sweat beading on his forehead as he repeatedly tapped the control tablet. Behind him, 12 representatives from Kuroda International sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence. Their lead negotiator, I recognized her from the preliminary meetings I'd been excluded from, was checking her watch with the universal expression of someone whose time was being wasted. Just a minor technical glitch. Hayes's voice came through tinny and desperate. Our IT team is. The IT director appeared in frame, leaning in to whisper something in Hayes's ear. Whatever he said made Hayes's face cycle through several shades of pale. The whisper turned into a heated exchange, Hayes gesturing wildly at the frozen display while the IT director spread his hands in the universal gesture of, "There's nothing I can do." I minimized the video and returned to my monitoring interface. The system logs told the story in clinical detail. They'd tried everything: administrator overrides, root access commands, even an attempted force restart that the system had politely declined to acknowledge. Each failed attempt was logged with time-stamp precision, a digital record of their growing desperation. At 10:34 a.m., they'd attempted to bypass Layer 7 entirely, trying to access the underlying hardware directly. The system's response was almost poetic in its simplicity. It began displaying the efficiency data from 2 years ago, before my optimizations, before the breakthroughs that made Helios Core revolutionary instead of merely competitive. Technically, they were getting a demonstration, just not the one they'd promised investors. The call started again at 10:41 a.m., this time from numbers I didn't recognize, board members, presumably, pulled from their morning schedules to deal with a crisis they didn't understand. I let them go to voicemail, each message a little more frantic than the last. Then came the text from Dr. Harrison, the chief scientist who'd originally approved my research proposal. "Isla, whatever happened between you and management, we need you here. The Japanese delegation is threatening to pull out. Decades of work is at stake." Decades of work, his work, he meant his reputation, his legacy built on the foundation of discoveries made by people like me. People whose names got edited out of the final story. But I'd learned something important in those sleepless nights in Building C. The work itself didn't care about credit or recognition. The equations were pure, the solutions elegant, regardless of whose name appeared on the patents. At 10:52 a.m., a new development. My monitoring system flagged an anomaly. Someone was trying to physically disconnect the Helios core from the presentation system, probably hoping to reset it to force a clean initialization. They didn't understand that Layer 7 existed at the quantum level, woven into the very fabric of how the system processed information. You couldn't disconnect it any more than you could disconnect your DNA from your cells. The video feed Maria had sent was still live. I watched Hayes abandon all pretense of control, openly arguing with what appeared to be the CEO himself. The Kuroda delegation was standing now, gathering their materials with the crisp efficiency of people who'd made their decision. $100 million of investment, walking out the door in real time. But it wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. At 11:03 a.m., I received an email from an address I didn't recognize, Legal Thorn Technologies, COM. My mother's company, the LLC she'd formed years ago for her consulting work, dormant since her retirement. The email contained a single attachment, an intellectual property assignment document dated 18 months ago, properly notarized and filed. I'd forgotten about it myself until this morning, during one of Dad's bad periods, when I'd been managing his care and working 100-hour weeks. Mom had insisted on protecting my interests. I'd signed the papers without really reading them, trusting her business instincts. She'd quietly assigned my personal research, everything I'd developed outside of direct employment tasks, to her LLC, with me as sole beneficiary. Layer 7 wasn't just undocumented in Novarris's systems. Legally, it had never belonged to them at all. The implications were delicious. Everything else, the core technology, the efficiency algorithms, the hardware specifications, that all belonged to Novarris. But the authentication protocol that made it all accessible? That was mine. They hadn't just fired me. They'd locked themselves out of their own future. The first call from legal came at 11:47 a.m. Not Novarris Legal. I'd blocked those numbers. This was from Whitman and Associates, the firm that handled Novarris's most sensitive negotiations, the kind of lawyers who billed more per hour than I'd made in a week. "Miss Carter, this is James Whitman." We need to discuss the immediate resolution of the current technical difficulties with the Helios core system. His voice was smooth, professional, carefully modulated to convey authority without desperation. But I'd learned to hear what wasn't being said. The fact that the senior partner was calling personally told me everything about their panic level. "I'm no longer an employee of Novaris," I replied, matching his tone. "I believe any technical issues should be directed to my replacement." A pause. "There seems to be some confusion about the authorization protocols. We're prepared to discuss compensation for your consulting services to resolve this matter quickly." "I'm not interested in consulting. Ms. Carter, I don't think you understand the situation. Novaris is prepared to be very generous." "Mr. Whitman," I interrupted, pulling up the intellectual property documents on my screen. "I understand the situation perfectly. Novaris owns the Helios core technology. All of it. Every patent, every line of code I wrote under their employment agreement. What I own, through Thorn Technologies LLC, is a specific authentication protocol that was developed independently. Your client is welcome to use their property however they see fit. Without the authentication protocol, the system is inaccessible." That does seem like a design flaw someone should have caught during review. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he spoke again, the smooth veneer had cracked slightly. "What do you want?" It was the question I'd been waiting for all morning. Not how much, what, because this had never been about money. "I want a meeting. Today. With the full board, Hayes, and the Kuroda delegation if they're still in town. I want to discuss the future of Helios Core and my role in it." "Your employment was terminated." "My employment is irrelevant. My ownership of Layer 7 authentication is not. You have 2 hours to arrange the meeting, or I'll be reaching out to Kuroda directly to discuss licensing my technology for their own development programs." The sharp intake of breath told me I'd hit the target. Kuroda had been courting me subtly for months, trying to poach me from Novaris. I'd been loyal then. That loyalty had expired at 5:59 a.m. By 12:15 p.m., the meeting was confirmed. 2:16 p.m., main boardroom. The speed of their capitulation told me the morning's disaster had been even worse than I'd imagined. Maria sent another text. "Stock price down 8% since the news broke about the failed demo. Whatever you're doing, it's working." I spent the next hour preparing. Not presentations or technical documents. Those were all locked in Novaris' servers anyway. Instead, I prepared myself. Shower. Professional clothes. The kind of careful grooming I'd neglected during the endless lab sessions. If they wanted to see the dismissed employee begging for her job back, they'd be disappointed. At 1:30 p.m., I called my father's nursing facility. He was having a good day, the nurse said, recognized her, ate his lunch, asked about the energy project his daughter was working on. I told her I'd visit tomorrow, after I fixed something important. The Uber ride to Novaris felt like traveling backward through time, the same route I'd taken thousands of times, watching the city wake up through bus windows at 5 a.m., or blur past in exhausted hazes at midnight. The building looked different now, less like home, more like a problem to be solved. Security tried to stop me at the lobby. Of course they did. My badge had been deactivated, my biometrics purged from their system. But Whitman was waiting, flanked by 2 junior associates, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in 3 hours. "Ms. Carter, thank you for coming," I nodded, letting him lead me through security, into the elevator, up to the executive floor I'd rarely visited. Each step felt deliberate, measured. I wasn't rushing anymore. Time was on my side now. At 1:58 p.m., we reached the boardroom. Through the glass, I could see them all gathered, 12 board members, Hayes looking like he'd been flayed alive. 3 representatives from Kuroda, including the lead negotiator who'd walked out that morning. The CEO, David Morrison, stood at the head of the table, his usual commanding presence somewhat diminished. Whitman opened the door. "Gentlemen, ladies, Ms. Carter has arrived." I walked in, calm as the eye of a storm, and took the only empty seat. the one they'd placed at the far end of the table, as far from power as possible. They were about to learn that power didn't always sit where you expected it to. The silence in the boardroom was exquisite. 12 of the most powerful people in the energy sector, reduced to waiting for me to speak first. I let it stretch, counting heartbeats, watching Hayes fidget with his portfolio. Finally, Morrison cleared his throat. Ms. Carter, we seem to have a misunderstanding regarding the Helios core authentication protocols. There's no misunderstanding, I said, sliding a single document across the table. Thorn Technologies owns Layer 7 authentication. I developed it independently, using my own resources, outside of Navarre's facilities. Your own employment agreement, Section 6.14, confirms that innovations developed off-site, on personal time, remain the property of the employee. Whitman had already seen the document, but watching the board members read it for the first time was satisfying. Their general counsel went pale. Hayes looked like he might vomit. You built a kill switch into our system? Hayes burst out, his carefully constructed executive persona finally cracking. I built an authentication protocol into my system, I corrected. One that Navarre's chose to integrate into their platform. One that was fully documented in the technical specifications your team approved without reading. The Kuroda delegation whispered among themselves in Japanese. I caught enough to understand they were impressed, not angry. In their culture, this kind of forward thinking was considered prudent, not treacherous. Morrison leaned forward. What are your terms? I thought about this moment for hours, imagining grand demands, vindictive requirements. But sitting there, looking at the people who'd tried to erase me, I realized I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition. Public acknowledgement as the creator and lead architect of Helios Core. My name restored to all patents and publications. And a licensing agreement between Novarus and Thorn Technologies for the use of Layer 7 authentication. The licensing fee? Whitman asked. $1 per year. The room erupted, board members talking over each other, lawyers frantically scribbling notes. Through it all, I sat perfectly still, waiting. Morrison raised his hand for silence. $1? Why? Because this was never about money. It was about truth. You tried to build a future on a foundation of lies, claiming credit for work you didn't understand. I'm offering you the chance to correct that mistake. Publicly acknowledge my role, and I'll ensure Helios Core functions perfectly for your demonstration tomorrow. Tomorrow? The lead Kuroda negotiator spoke for the first time. The demonstration was today. No, I smiled. Today was a lesson. Tomorrow is when you show them what Helios Core can really do. With its creator running the presentation. Hayes stood abruptly. This is extortion. Sit down, Dominic. Morrison's voice was ice. You're done talking. He turned back to me. You want to run the demonstration? I want to show the world what we built. What I built. With the support of a team that deserves better leadership than they've gotten. Kuroda should see not just the technology, but the truth behind it. The negotiations took 3 hours. Lawyers arguing over language, board members protecting their egos, Hayes being escorted out after his third outburst. But eventually, inevitably, they agreed to everything. The press release would go out within the hour. The patents would be amended. And tomorrow, I would stand in front of the world's largest energy investors and show them the future. At 5:17 p.m., I signed the agreement. My biometric signature, the same one Layer 7 had been waiting for all day, sealed the deal. Somewhere in the building, Helios Core hummed back to life, recognizing its creator's return. I didn't go back to the lab that night. Instead, I went to see my father. He was sleeping when I arrived, but I sat with him anyway, telling him about the equations that had worked, about the solution he'd inspired. I don't know if he heard me, but I like to think somewhere in his dreams, he understood. The next morning, the demonstration went flawlessly. Helios Core performed beyond even my expectations, as if it had been waiting to show off. The Kuroda delegation signed the investment agreement on the spot. $1.3 billion, contingent on me remaining as chief technology architect. I accepted. but only after they agreed to one more term: the creation of the Carter Innovation Lab, named after my father, dedicated to the kind of unstructured research that makes impossible things possible. Hayes's resignation was announced that afternoon. Morrison lasted another 6 months before the board replaced him with someone who understood that innovation requires more than spreadsheets and PowerPoints. And me? I got back to work, because in the end, that's what this was all about. Not revenge, not vindication, but the simple right to continue building the future I could see so clearly. The future remembered who had built it, and now, finally, so did everyone else. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're hearing this from. Leave a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale of justice in the tech world, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts on what you would have done in Isla's position.